Hi everyone, and welcome to this next tutorial in our Flash game design series. We're trying to create a game of Pong, and we're busy trying to understand Actionscript. And wow, I've got quite a lot of Actionscript happening at the moment, and this is the state of my game. So I've got the computer paddle moving, I can control the player paddle, and the ball is bouncing off the edges of the game area and the two paddles. Brilliant. And we know that when the ball bounces off that edge there, bounce, the computer gets a point. The computer gets another point. The computer gets a point. Wow, I think the computer's winning this game. And we know that when the ball bounces off this edge here, on the right side, the player gets a point. Okay? So these are the ideas that we're going to be looking at in today's tutorial as we try to add a score to the game. So when the ball bounces off the right edge of the game area, which is this edge over here, when the ball bounces off the right edge, we know that the player gets a point. And when the ball bounces off the left edge, that should be left, when the ball bounces off the left edge, the player gets a point. Sorry, the computer gets a point. Does that make sense? So these two blocks of code here are going to be very important in today's tutorial. Okay, we are going to be adding some lines. You are going to be adding some lines of code here, and we'll get to that in a moment. Before we begin all of that, we need to set up a couple of variables to store the values of the player point and the computer point. Okay. So I'm just going to create a new variable called pscore. This is my player score, and it will be an integer, a whole number. And I'll set up another variable called cscore, and that will also be an integer. And I know that pscore at the beginning of the game is equal to 0. Notice we're not in the game loop yet, we're just at the beginning of the game. When the game loads, we set up some variables and assign some values. And I also know that at the beginning of the game, the computer score is also equal to 0. So let's just put some comments in here so we know what we're doing. Create variables to store the score of the game. And then here, we're just going to assign 0 to each score at the beginning of the game. Now, in our game area, we need to see the scores up here. So we need some text boxes to display the scores. In fact, do you remember my game design? I already put in some text boxes, didn't I? There they are. Let's just have a look at the properties of these text boxes. This one I'm going to call player score. Okay? The instance name of this box here is player score. And this one, I'm going to call it computer score. Computer score. Okay? So if you haven't given these two text boxes instance names, please do that as you follow this tutorial. Now back to Actionscript. At the very start of the game, this is before we go into the game loop, I'm going to assign some data to those two text boxes. My player score box will have a text value of something, which will be player plus pscore. Now notice that this is going to display player, and it's going to append onto that whatever this variable here, the pscore variable, is holding. So at the beginning of the game, pscore is equal to 0, so this will show player 0. And my computer score text box is going to display computer plus C-score, whatever the value of C-score is. Okay? So if we... Brilliant. Okay? Now, you can mess around in your design with... Let's just go back to properties again. With the size of the text, you can play with the size, you can change the color of the text. Maybe you want to have some, maybe blue. What you'll also find, you might get an error if you choose a font that, I don't know, how do I explain this? A font that might have to be imported depending on the computer that's playing the game. I recommend you choose the most basic font of all, which is _100. Fully recommend it. And any computer that plays your game should be able to recognize that font. If you choose some fancy font like Edwardian script ITC, another computer that's playing your game might not recognize that font, and it will give you an error. So as you're setting up your score text boxes, I recommend you choose the most basic font family possible, and any computer will happily play your game. Okay? So now I've got blue text for the player. Right, this is now the point of the tutorial where I'm going to give you a challenge. At the beginning of the game, we have set up two variables to store the player score and the computer score. We've also assigned some data to those two variables, and we're also updating the player score and the computer score text boxes with those values. Now we all know that when the ball bounces off the right edge of the game area, the player gets a point. So can you update the player score with a line of code here? And can you also update the player score text box that we just looked at? So you're going to need to update two things. A line of code here to update the player score, and a line of code here to update the player score text box. We also know that when the ball bounces off the left edge of the game area, the computer gets a point. So can you write a line of code to update the computer score? Remember, it starts at 0, but when it hits the left edge of the game area, it becomes 1, and if it does it again, it becomes 2, etc. And we also need to update the computer score text box. So these are the challenges in today's tutorial. Can you figure out how to update the player score? Remember, at the start of the game, the player score is 0. And if the ball, go on ball, hit the right edge, go on then, there you go, boom! Player should become 1. That should become 1. And let me tell you, that should become 1 because our text boxes, this is something I should have just repeated a bit earlier, our text boxes are dynamic text. Make sure you have a dynamic text setting. Okay? Dynamic text means the contents of the text box can change during the animation runtime. Okay? So, have a go and see if you can figure out how to create these lines of code.